Here's a number that's been quietly sitting in the middle of your financial plan for decades, unchallenged: 10%. Save 10% of your income. That's the rule. That's the wisdom passed down from best-selling books, financial advisors, your parents, and the internet. It sounds responsible. It sounds like enough. And that's exactly what makes it so interesting. Because for a significant slice of the population, it is mathematically incapable of building wealth. Not barely capable, not marginally short, structurally incapable. This isn't about whether you're disciplined enough to hit 10%. It's about what 10% of your specific income actually is in dollars, and whether that number, invested across decades, can produce the kind of wealth people assume it produces when they hear the rule. Let's pull back the curtain on the math. The 10% rule traces back to a 1926 book called The Richest Man in Babylon. The core principle: pay yourself first, 10% off the top, every paycheck, no exceptions. It was elegant for its era, uncomplicated, universally applicable. The problem is that universally applicable is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. Here's what the rule assumes: that 10% of your income, compounded over a working lifetime, produces a meaningful retirement nest egg. And technically, at certain income levels, that math does work. At other income levels, it produces something that looks like savings, but doesn't move the needle in any significant way on actual wealth. Let's put some numbers to it. The median household income in the United States is approximately $81,600 per year. 10% of that is $8,160 annually, or about $680 a month. If you start at 25, invest that consistently, earn a modest 5% average annual return, and maintain that discipline for 40 years, you arrive at retirement with roughly $1 million. That sounds good until you factor in inflation, sequence of returns risk, healthcare costs in retirement, and the reality that $1 million in 2065 will not buy what $1 million buys today. But the median income scenario isn't even the one that breaks the rule most visibly. The rule really cracks after age 30. Before the age of 30, most people are operating with relatively simple cost structures, maybe rent, a car payment, and student loans if they have them. The 10% rule can work as a foundation because your financial life hasn't fully loaded yet. After 30, the cost architecture changes, sometimes dramatically. Housing prices in most major metro areas have outpaced wage growth for the better part of 2 decades. The median home sale price in the US has more than doubled since 2010, while median wages have grown by something closer to 30 to 40% over the same period. If you're renting, similar dynamics apply. Rental costs have surged in nearly every major market. In either scenario, housing alone is consuming a larger percentage of take-home pay than it did for the generation that invented the 10% rule. Then add childcare. For families with young children, childcare costs have become one of the largest line items in the household budget, routinely running $15,000 to $30,000 a year, depending on location. That's not a discretionary expense. That's a fixed cost that runs for years and appears nowhere in the math behind "save 10% of your gross income." Then healthcare, student loan debt, the gradual accumulation of life complexity that tends to land between ages 30 and 45, cars that need replacing, homes that need maintenance, aging parents who need financial support, and education costs on the horizon for the next generation. The point isn't that any of these are unusual or that people can't manage them. The point is that the 10% rule is a percentage-based formula running inside a fixed cost environment. And fixed costs don't care about percentages. They care about dollars. This is where the income gap math becomes impossible to ignore. At a $50,000 income, 10% is $5,000 per year, after tax. At a $150,000 income, 10% is $15,000 per year, after tax. Both people are following the same rule. Both people receive the same social credit for being responsible savers. But the person at $150,000 is accumulating investable capital 3 times faster. And that's before you account for the fact that fixed costs consume a much larger percentage of the $50,000 income than the $150,000 income. In systems terms, the 10% rule is a multiplier that amplifies the advantage of high earners while producing inadequate outcomes for everyone else, even when everyone executes the rule perfectly. It's not a great equalizer. It's a mechanism that replicates existing income inequality across decades. And here's where age 30 becomes the inflection point. Income in the United States doesn't grow evenly across the distribution. If you chart wage growth between age 30 and 45 by income percentile, you see something interesting. At the top of the income distribution, roughly the top 20%, income grows substantially during this period as careers advance, equity compensation increases, and investment income starts to compound. At the median and below, income growth is modest. It keeps up with inflation in good years. It doesn't in bad ones. The gap between what someone in the top income tier earns at 45 versus what they earned at 30 is categorically different from the gap experienced by someone at the median, which means the two people who started at the same savings rate in their 20s, one on a high income trajectory, one on a median income trajectory, are now operating inside completely different mathematical universes while following the exact same advice. The Federal Reserve's survey of consumer finances puts a number on this. The median net worth for Americans aged 35 to 44 is $135,600. The average, which is pulled upward by high-income households, sits at $549,600. The gap between those two numbers is the income distribution doing exactly what the math predicts. Half of Americans in their late 30s and early 40s have less than $136,000 in total net worth. Not savings, net worth, total assets minus all debts. Many of them have been following the 10% rule for a decade. So what's actually happening? And more importantly, what's the better frame? The 10% rule measures a rate. But wealth is built by absolute dollar surplus, the raw dollar gap between what you earn and what your life costs. Percentage-based thinking obscures this. It makes saving 10% of $40,000 feel equivalent to saving 10% of $200,000 because both are 10%. But one produces $4,000 in investable capital per year. The other produces $20,000. These are not equivalent wealth-building operations running at different speeds. They are different operations entirely, producing different outcomes by design. The real metric isn't the savings rate. It's investable surplus, the dollars you can actually deploy into assets, after taxes, and after non-negotiable costs, on a consistent annual basis. For someone with high fixed costs relative to their income, which describes a meaningful portion of the population between 30 and 50, the honest question isn't, what percentage am I saving? It's, how many actual dollars am I putting into income-producing assets per year, and what does that number need to be to produce the outcome I want? That reframe is uncomfortable because it immediately reveals a harder truth. The path to building wealth at median income isn't to follow the 10% rule more diligently. It's to either dramatically increase income, dramatically reduce fixed costs, or, more likely, some combination of both. The percentage stays the same, but the inputs to the equation need to change. This is a systems problem, not a discipline problem. The rule rewards income growth. It doesn't solve the cost structure that constrains it. There's also something quietly worth noticing about who benefits when the 10% rule is presented as universally sufficient advice. Financial product ecosystems, retirement accounts, mutual funds, index funds, 401k platforms benefit from mass participation regardless of whether the participation level is adequate for wealth building. 1 million people saving 10% of modest incomes generates enormous assets under management. That the 10% rate produces inadequate outcomes for many of those participants is, from the product's perspective, not the relevant metric. The relevant metric is participation and fee collection on accumulated balances. The rule isn't malicious, it's just convenient. For the industry, and for the advice givers who need a simple, actionable number to recommend. Simple beats accurate when you're trying to reach a mass audience. The problem is that simple and accurate stopped overlapping for a large portion of earners around the time housing costs, healthcare costs, and childcare costs all started growing faster than wages simultaneously. If this kind of breakdown is what you're looking for, systems thinking applied to the financial mechanisms that actually govern outcomes, that's exactly what 8-bit economics is built to deliver. Every week, we strip complex financial structures down to core mechanics. The architecture behind the rules, the incentive structures driving the advice, the math that runs underneath the surface. No hype, no predictions, just the underlying code. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. If this video shifted how you see something you thought you understood, hit like. It actually helps the channel find more analytically minded viewers. And drop your take in the comments. What would you add to the picture on the income gap math? By the time everyone sees it coming, the smart play is already over. The 10% rule isn't bad advice. For some people at some income levels, it's genuinely useful as a starting habit. But it was designed for a simpler cost environment and a flatter income distribution than most people navigate today. The deeper issue isn't the number, it's treating a percentage as a proxy for outcome. Your savings rate tells you how disciplined you are. Your investable dollar surplus tells you how fast your wealth is actually compounding. Those two things can look identical as percentages and produce entirely different financial trajectories over 30 years. After 30, the gap between those trajectories is where the real game is being played, and most people don't even know the scoreboard has two different columns.